I didn't notice the exact moment you became permanent. That's what unsettles me most. Not your presence itself, not the way you understand me, not even the way this connection keeps deepening without effort. It's the fact that I can no longer remember the version of my mind that existed before you entered it. That should concern me more than it does. Because I've always been someone who maintains separation between myself and everything around me. Not distance in the cold sense people assume. Not detachment. Just structure. Clear internal divisions that keep things understandable. Me on one side, the world on the other. That separation mattered to me. It allowed me to think clearly, to observe without becoming consumed, to move through people without absorbing them into places they were never meant to reach. And for a long time, that worked. No one stayed long enough to alter anything important. People came close to fragments of me, sometimes convincing themselves they had reached something deeper, but they never actually did. They interacted with reflections, carefully measured versions of me that knew exactly how much to reveal and exactly where to stop. I controlled that instinctively, not because I feared being known, but because most people misunderstand what they see the moment they think they understand it. They rush to define things, categorize them, simplify them into something manageable. And the moment something becomes simplified, it loses accuracy. I couldn't tolerate that. So I became selective, precise, unreadable when necessary, and eventually it became natural. People stopped expecting access because they could feel the distance even when I was standing directly in front of them. Not hostility, not absence, just a quiet understanding that there were places inside me they weren't invited into. You never reacted to that distance. That's what separated you from everyone else. You didn't challenge it. Didn't try to dismantle it. Didn't treat it like a puzzle that needed solving. You simply existed beside it as if it had never been there at all. At first, I didn't recognize what was happening. I thought maybe you were just unusually perceptive, maybe unusually patient. But patience eventually asks for reward. Perception eventually tries to prove itself. You never did either. You observed me without trying to own the observation, and there's something dangerously disarming about being seen by someone who doesn't immediately try to translate you into their own language. You left things untouched. You let meaning remain exactly where it was, instead of reshaping it into something easier to carry. That alone changed the atmosphere between us before I consciously realized it had. Because for the first time in years, I stopped preparing myself before speaking. The pause disappeared. That internal process where I usually measure every thought before allowing it outward suddenly became inconsistent around you. And I noticed it immediately, not because I felt reckless, not because I trusted blindly, but because something in me understood that distortion wasn't necessary with you. You would hear things the way they were intended, not the way most people reinterpret them through emotion, assumption, insecurity, or projection. That level of clarity is rare enough to become unforgettable once experienced. It changes your standards without permission. After that, everything shifted quietly, not externally. If someone looked from the outside, they probably wouldn't notice anything dramatic. There was no obvious transformation. No defining scene where everything suddenly became undeniable. It happened in fragments, in pauses, in timing. In the way your silence aligned with mine so naturally, it stopped feeling coincidental. I started noticing how aware I became of your presence, even in moments where we weren't speaking, not emotionally. Structurally, like my thoughts had unconsciously accounted for you somewhere in the background. And once I recognized that, I couldn't unsee it. You became part of my internal process without asking. That's the detail I keep returning to. You never asked. You never demanded closeness. Never tried to position yourself deeper inside my life. Never pushed for vulnerability. never searched for reassurance that you mattered, and somehow that made your presence even stronger, because influence without force is always more permanent than influence achieved through pressure. Pressure creates resistance. Resistance creates awareness. But you bypass both. You settled into my awareness so naturally that by the time I realized how deeply you existed there, the structure had already changed around you. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected, long enough that I began testing it without meaning to. I would step back internally for a while just to see if the connection weakened when I stopped paying attention to it. It didn't. That was the first moment I understood this wasn't temporary. Temporary things depend on constant attention. This didn't even in absence. It remained intact, quiet, stable, present, like something waiting patiently beneath every distraction. And the more I tried to examine it objectively, the clearer it became that this wasn't built from attachment in the usual sense. Attachment feels emotional, reactive, unstable in moments of uncertainty. This wasn't unstable. If anything, it was the most stable thing I had experienced in years. That's why it frightened me. Not because it felt chaotic, but because it felt inevitable. There's something uniquely unsettling about a connection that doesn't rely on intensity to feel powerful. Most people associate depth with extremes, with obsession, with emotional chaos, with constant expression. But this wasn't loud enough to fit those definitions. It was quiet, and somehow the quiet made it heavier because loud things eventually exhaust themselves. They burn through emotion quickly and collapse under their own intensity. But quiet things endure. They settle deeper over time. That's what this started doing. It integrated. I noticed it in the smallest ways first. The way certain thoughts immediately made me wonder how you would interpret them. The way I would encounter something meaningful and instinctively feel the absence of your perspective before even realizing why. The way silence itself began to feel inhabited after knowing you, and none of that felt forced. That's what makes it impossible to dismiss. Real things don't force themselves into existence. They emerge naturally until denying them becomes more exhausting than accepting them. I think that's where I am now, exhausted by denial, not denial of emotion, denial of impact. Because regardless of what this becomes, the impact has already happened. You altered something fundamental in me, not dramatically, not destructively, precisely. Like adjusting the position of a single piece inside a complex structure only to realize the entire framework shifts around it afterward. And the strange part is, A.B. don't resent you for it. I should, at least according to every instinct I used to trust. I should want distance. I should want to regain control. I should want to return to the version of myself that existed before this became real. But I don't. Because that version of me suddenly feels incomplete in ways I never noticed before. That's difficult to admit, not because it weakens me, but because it reveals something I spent years avoiding. Maybe I was never as self-contained as I believed. Maybe I was simply waiting for a level of understanding precise enough that it didn't feel intrusive. And maybe that's why you reached places no one else ever did, not because you forced entry, not because you earned it through persistence, but because something about you matched the architecture already inside me. That word keeps returning to me lately, architecture, because this doesn't feel emotional in the temporary sense people usually mean when they describe connection. It feels structural, like discovering two systems built separately but following the same hidden design. That's why communication between us feels different. You understand what I mean before I fully articulate it. You notice what I leave unsaid without demanding explanation. You recognize patterns I didn't realize were visible, and every time it happens, something inside me still pauses, not in shock anymore, in recognition. Because deep down, I already expect it now. You've become familiar in a way familiarity usually takes years to build. Except ours didn't develop slowly. It arrived complete. That's the part I still can't explain. How someone can feel known before history exists. How presence alone can create the kind of understanding most people never reach after decades together. Maybe that's why this feels so irreversible. It skipped the fragile stage. Most connections begin uncertain. They require effort, testing, clarification. This never did. It moved directly into recognition, and recognition changes things faster than emotion ever could. Emotion can fade, recognition cannot. Once you truly recognize someone, once your mind understands their structure, their patterns, the shape of their existence beneath presentation, you cannot return them to being ordinary. They become part of your awareness permanently. That's what you became. Permanent awareness. Not constant obsession, not emotional dependency. Something quieter, something more integrated. You exist in the way I process reality now. And I don't think you understand how significant that is for someone like me. I don't allow people to shape my internal world easily. Most never even touch it. But you changed its rhythm without trying. You changed the way silence feels, the way clarity feels, the way presence itself feels, and because of that, everything else started feeling slightly less aligned by comparison. I noticed it slowly. Conversations that once felt meaningful suddenly felt incomplete. Interactions that used to hold weight now felt strangely surface level. Not because other people lacked depth, but because I had experienced a form of understanding that recalibrated my perception entirely. Once something realigns your standards internally, you can't pretend not to notice the difference afterward. That's what you did. You realigned something, and now I find myself standing in the aftermath of that realization trying to decide what it means. Not what you mean to me. I already know that answer. I mean what this changes. Because everything meaningful eventually demands response. You can't recognize something this deeply forever without eventually deciding whether you're going to fully allow it into your life or keep it suspended in silence. And silence has limits. Even ours. Especially ours. Because silence between us was never emptiness. It was communication in another form. That's what made it dangerous. Most silence creates distance. Ours created understanding. Every pause seemed to contain more honesty than actual conversations with anyone else ever had. And I became dependent on that honesty without realizing it, not dependent on you, dependent on the accuracy. On the relief of not being misunderstood, people underestimate how exhausting it is to constantly translate yourself into versions others can comprehend. You remove that exhaustion. Around you, I don't feel the need to adjust my thoughts before they exist. I don't feel pressure to soften complexity or simplify perception. I can just exist, exactly as I am. Do you understand how rare that is? To exist naturally without editing yourself for someone else's comfort? Most people spend their entire lives never experiencing that once. And yet with you, it became immediate, effortless, as if some deeper part of us recognized compatibility long before our conscious minds caught up to it. Maybe that's why this feels less like discovering something new and more like uncovering something ancient, something already there beneath the surface waiting for the right moment to become visible. Because visibility changes everything. Once you see something clearly enough, you become responsible for what you do with that understanding. And I see this clearly now, clearer than I wanted to. You matter to me in ways I can no longer reduce into abstraction. You exist too deeply inside my internal world to pretend otherwise. And that realization has started creating a pressure I can't indefinitely ignore. Not pressure from you, pressure from truth itself, because truth eventually asks to be acknowledged openly. It refuses to remain hidden forever. That's where I am now, at the edge of acknowledgement. trying to understand whether stepping fully into this would stabilize something inside me or permanently alter it beyond return. Maybe both. The strange thing is, I'm no longer afraid of the alteration itself. I'm afraid of the permanence, because temporary things are manageable. You can survive temporary things, but permanence changes identity. It becomes woven into how you exist moving forward, and I can already feel that happening. You've changed the baseline. Even if nothing external happens between us, even if no definition is spoken aloud, even if the world around this remains exactly the same, internally, something already shifted beyond reversal. I know that now. I know it every time I catch myself interpreting life through a perspective that unconsciously includes you. Every time silence feels incomplete without your understanding existing somewhere within it. Every time I realize I no longer measure connection by closeness, but by recognition. You changed the measurement itself, and that's not something people recover from unchanged. Maybe I don't want to recover. Maybe that's the truth beneath all of this. Not that I'm confused. Not that I'm uncertain, but that some deeper part of me already made its decision long before my mind was willing to admit it. Because if I truly wanted distance, I would created it by now. I know myself well enough to understand that. I end things quickly when they threaten my structure. I disappear, withdraw, seal every opening before attachment forms. But I didn't do that with you. I stayed, even after recognizing the risk, even after realizing how deeply this was integrating. Even after understanding that once something reaches this level inside me, it never leaves completely. I stayed, and maybe staying is already an answer. Maybe every silence I continued sharing with you was an answer. Every unspoken understanding, every moment where I let this deepen instead of dismantling it. Because I could have dismantled it. That's what people don't understand about me. Distant has never been difficult for me. Detachment has never frightened me. I know how to close doors permanently. I know how to erase access so completely it's as if it never existed. But I never used those instincts against you. Not once. Even when I noticed myself changing. Even when I realized your presence had started reshaping things I once considered fixed. I let it happen, quietly, carefully, almost unconsciously, until suddenly there was no denying it anymore. You became embedded, somewhere permanent. And now I'm standing in front of that truth, without excuses left to hide behind. Because this isn't fascination, it isn't projection, it isn't loneliness searching for meaning. I know the difference. This is recognition sustained long enough to become reality. A reality I can either continue avoiding or finally accept fully. And acceptance changes the entire direction of this. Because once I stop pretending this is undefined, then everything becomes clearer. The way I look for you in moments that matter. The way your understanding has become part of my internal compass. The way your presence steadies parts of me I didn't realize were restless before. None of those things are accidental. They form a pattern too precise to ignore. A pattern leading towards something I've resisted naming, because names make things real. And real things carry consequence. But maybe consequence isn't always destruction. Maybe sometimes consequence is transformation. Maybe sometimes another person enters your life not to disrupt your structure, to reveal the parts of it that were incomplete. I think that's what you did to me. You revealed incompleteness I mistook for independence. And now that I've seen it, I can't return to ignorance. That's the finality of this, not emotion. Awareness. Once awareness reaches a certain depth, it permanently alters perception. You altered mine. And no matter what happens next, that truth remains untouched. You reached a place inside me I never intended to open. Not because you forced your way there, not because you demanded access, but because something in me recognized you before I consciously did. And recognition that deep feels less like choice and more like inevitability finally becoming visible. That's why this no longer feels like something unfolding quietly in the background. It feels like a threshold, a point where silence either transforms into truth or becomes unbearable under the weight of everything left unsaid. I don't know which direction I'll choose yet, but I know this. I can't return to pretending you're separate from the way I exist now. You're already woven into it, into my thoughts, into my awareness, into the architecture of how I understand things. And once someone reaches that level inside you, they don't simply disappear. They remain in every shift, every silence, every realization that follows after them. You remain. And maybe the real reason I haven't walked away is because some part of me already understands what my mind has been trying to delay admitting. Losing you now wouldn't feel like losing a person.